Marvel or DC is the age-old argument that every person even remotely into superhero comics has heard at least once in their lifetime. As the two main suppliers of superhero content to the masses, it's natural that the two conglomerates are pitted against one another. But the real question lies in what the people actually associated with these companies prefer. In an interesting turn of events, Marvel legend Samuel L. Jackson confessed he prefers DC Comics, and here's all you need to know about it. First up, Samuel L. Jackson in the context of the MCU. It would be nearly impossible to live in the modern-day world with access to an internet connection and have never heard of the growing giant that is the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or the Marvel Comics. The comic book series, turned into one of the largest visual cinematic universes of the decade, has enough superhero fantasy content to keep one entertained for a good while. Being cast in an MCU movie is a big deal for many actors, and being one of the first people to be part of the MCU is a great acting credit to add to your resume. Samuel L. Jackson has been part of the MCU for over a decade now, so it would probably be a given that his preferred comic book indulgence would lean towards the company he's employed under, Marvel. But it seems as though that is definitively not the case. Does Samuel L. Jackson prefer DC Comics? Beloved Nick Fury of the MCU admitted that he prefers DC Comics to Marvel, and although the debate has been dragged over the years, no one could have expected an actor so intrinsically tied to one franchise openly admitting he enjoys comics from a company that primarily competes with the one he's employed under. What's more interesting is that over the years, answers to the debate have had multiple supporting arguments, be it the visual content they've managed to produce or just the mere originality of the story structure. But interestingly enough, the common argument used against Marvel Comics seems to not be the motivation for Jackson's remarks on his preferences. On the Happy Sad Confused podcast, Samuel L. Jackson confessed that when it comes to reading comic books, he prefers what DC has to offer. Why does he prefer DC Comics over Marvel? However, it has very little to do with the comparison of quality. In the podcast, he explained that he's a comic book fan in general, and as such, has been reading comic books practically his whole life. Then, unprompted, he admitted that he doesn't even read Marvel comic books, and never has. He did say that he at least looks at them, especially since he was cast as Nick Fury, but then he started seeing himself in the comics, going on to state that whenever he'd look at the Marvel comics and see himself on the cover, he started to think, what am I doing on this comic book cover? But even so, with the slight recognizability, he still didn't read the comic books. He'd put them back on the rack. He admitted that he's read DC Comics his whole life, then implied that it was the norm. Jackson admitted that we all grew up with Superman, Batman, Aquaman, etc., and despite being a generalized statement, it's definitely mostly true. Marvel's biggest sellers for the longest time, before the emergence of the MCU, were, after all, Spider-Man, the X-Men, and the Fantastic Four. Even when Marvel gave the rights of these characters away, very few successful movies came out of their deals. So there's definitely something to be said about why DC heroes are more prevalent in pop culture, as opposed to Marvel superheroes. What else did he say? But is that all? Samuel L. Jackson may have saved himself a ton of undeserved social media ridicule when he answered a question about ever being interested in taking up a role for the DCEU, or the DC Extended Universe. On the same podcast, Samuel L. Jackson was asked if he would ever act in a DC movie, now that they too have a kind of cohesion amongst most of their movies. But the Pulp Fiction star seemed unsure. However, the reasons run deeper than his loyalty to the MCU and not giving in to its main competitors, if they should be called as such, in the market. He doesn't seem to be a big fan of the movies that the DC Extended Universe seems to have pumped out in the last few years. According to Jackson, actors are mercenaries, and that's kind of what they do. They act for who they act for. So it's not as much a question of if, but a question of why. He doesn't believe that he might ever read a DC script that makes him go, yeah, this is dope. He did say that he was all about DC, so he is definitely still a fan of the content they produce on paper at least, but he doesn't yet know what the thing is about them cinematically. Next, Samuel L. Jackson on himself and his impact on Hollywood. Not enough can be said on how much of an impact Samuel L. Jackson has had on the Hollywood industry as a whole, but to him, it can get hard to admit that he's actually a movie star, as he explained in the same podcast. He said that over the years, he believes to have represented Hollywood in ways that allows them to say that he epitomizes being a worker bee in the business. To him, he wishes to be someone one can look at and say, and he may not have been voted by his peers, or the movies he's been in haven't been nominated, or the roles he's played have been robbed a few times, but hey, he represents us in the best way we can be represented. Now we will talk about MCU's next moves. The devil may work hard, but Kevin Feige works harder at bringing MCU content to a never-satisfied audience. After the admittedly understandable break in new releases due to COVID-19 and the resulting pandemic, Marvel seems to have recovered unnaturally quickly. But that's not a bad thing, especially when the demand for new content related to the MCU grows exponentially each day. For example, Marvel already has at least 24 projects underway right now, each in a different developmental stage. Projects most likely to hit the big screen, provided everything goes smoothly, are Captain America 4, starring Sam Wilson as Captain America after being established in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. But even before that is Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness that is set to hit the theaters in a mere few months now. There's also Werewolf by Night, a slightly spooky new endeavor for the MCU. Expected to hit Disney Plus this fall, the Halloween special will introduce and center around the title character, Werewolf. Here's one you may not have known was happening, but will be excited for regardless. The Ten Rings will focus on Xia Ling, played by Menger Zhang, in the movie it's derived from. This series may be mildly comedic in nature. Where does DC's success lie? But enough about upcoming projects for Marvel. Let's talk about DC and the resounding success they've seen with their latest movie, The Batman, starring Robert Pattinson. To say that DC movies, and more specifically Batman movies, are a risk that the DCEU can't stop taking would be an understatement. It would be fair to say that nothing's quite reached the same high for the DCEU as Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight trilogy, and it would also not be a lie to say that the DCEU has been chasing success similar to that for years. In chasing this idealistic fame, they've managed to turn most of their earlier DCEU movies into gritty noirs that don't always appeal to the masses. But more recently, it seems as though the DCEU has stopped trying to appease those who desperately want them to build a cinematic universe and have started focusing on stories that aren't necessarily interlinked, and that's clearly worked in their favor. Both Pattinson's and Zoe Kravitz's performance in the movie have been praised heavily, as this noir met many of the expectations set upon it nearly flawlessly. The movie crossed $600 million at the box office worldwide, and it hasn't even been a month since its release. Next, Batman's return to his noir detective origin. Robert Pattinson's Batman has been praised for several reasons: wearing mascara, journaling, being generally angsty, and in the shadows. But all of those small reasons lead up to the bigger conclusion, and it brought Batman back to who he is supposed to be, away from Affleck's tired aging Batman plot and Bale's origin story-centric Batman. Pattinson's Bruce Wayne is still young, and as such is still figuring out the ropes to truly become Batman. He's humanized in his puzzle solving and crime fighting. People have always been a fan of what Batman tries to present, a hero with good intentions and no superpowers, besides his raging wealth, of course. And that's all for today. What do you think of Samuel L. Jackson's preference for DC Comics? Let us know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed watching this video, be sure to leave a like and share the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications by pressing the bell icon to get notified every time we post a new video. And we will see you next time. Thanks for watching.